Hello and welcome back to Introduction to SPSS Tutorials. This tutorial is going to cover creating histograms in SPSS. So to be clear up front, we're going to create a histogram when we have continuous data. Continuous data is a variable that measures the amount of something, some variable of interest. And more specifically, histograms are meant for discrete continuous data. So discrete variables are variables where we measure the amount of something, but we're only capturing that measurement at specific intervals. So if we look at the data set we have here, we have three continuous variables. We have two variables that capture the number of miles that participants biked during the first 2 weeks of their training. And then we have a time variable, which represents the amount of time the participant spent biking. So the difference you'll notice between these variables is that the number of miles biked in the first 2 weeks of training is captured in whole miles. So we don't have any participants where we say they trained by biking 1.5 miles or 8 3/4 miles or 7 1/3 miles. We just capture whole miles. So that's what we would call a discrete variable. The time variable, on the other hand, is a variable where we've captured very precisely the number of minutes out to 2 decimal places where they were training. So we would not consider this a discrete variable because we can be very exact. We're not capturing anything to the specific minute or hour or anything like that. We can have measurements that exist kind of anywhere along the range of the number of minutes that we're interested in, carried out to very precise levels, right? So we would actually not use a histogram to graph the time variable because of the fact that it's so precise and that we carry this out to a few decimal places. We would use what's called a frequency polygram for that, which I'll demonstrate in a different tutorial. But let's focus on histograms in this tutorial. So if I want to create a histogram specifically of the number of miles that participants biked in general in the first week of training, click on Graphs and click on Chart Builder. So this will open up our basic Chart Builder workspace, and I want to scroll down in the lower left corner to the histogram option. That'll give me 4 different types of graphs, and for a basic histogram I'm going to stick with this first option, the simple histogram. Drag and drop that up into the chart workspace. And then all I need to do is whatever variable that I want to graph, I'm going to click on that and drag it down onto where it says x-axis. So if I want the number of miles biked in the first week of training, drag that down onto the x-axis. You'll get a little preview here. Just remember that SPSS generates this preview based on random images that it has stored. It has really nothing to do with your data, even though it looks like it should. Don't expect your histogram to actually look like the chart. If it does, it's just a coincidence. Okay, so at this point we can just click OK and generate a histogram. So in our output menu, what you'll see is a basic histogram with the number of miles biked in the first week of training. So to be clear, let's point out a couple of properties of the histogram. First of all, histograms are different from bar graphs in that the bars in a histogram touch. That's meant to imply something specific. It's meant to imply that the bars are in order and that their relationship to one another matters, right? And so that's because we're graphing continuous data. The x-axis flows in a specific order. We would not ever want to rearrange the order that these bars are presented. The order means something. It means that as we go from left to right, the bars that are graphed represent that the participants represented by these bars biked more miles. So down here next to 0, these participants biked very few miles, and as we get up closer to 20, these participants biked many, many more miles. Right? And so to be clear, the histogram does represent frequency data. So each of these bars represents the number of participants that biked whatever the number of miles was that's represented here. Now I think it looks, from looking at this graph, like SPSS decided to graph this in each 1 mile buckets, meaning each bar represents one specific mileage. So I would say that this bar represents all the participants who biked 1 mile, which looks like it was 5. This second bar would represent all the participants who biked 2 miles. The third bar would be all the participants that biked 3 miles, right? And so on and so forth. And so if we look at the y-axis, that's telling us how many participants biked this specific number of miles. Now, what I'll point out is we've got a lot of bars here, and that is separating our data out in a very detailed way. And maybe we want this, but maybe we want to group our bars in a more general way, and we can do that. So we didn't tell SPSS specifically how we wanted our graph to look the first time, but let's go back to Chart Builder and let's give SPSS some more details about what we want our graph to look like. So you'll notice that this element properties box over here pops up every time we open the Chart Builder, and so this element properties box is where we can give SPSS some more specifics about what we want our graph to look like. So for the histogram, let's click on where it says set parameters, and we can adjust some things to make our chart look a little more tailored to what we want. Our first option is to decide what we want our anchor to be, and so the anchor is the value at which the very first bar in the histogram is going to start. Right? So if we leave it on automatic, SPSS is essentially just going to select the lowest number of miles that anybody biked, and that's going to be the starting point. And maybe we're okay with that. But if we wanted to set a custom value, if we wanted our chart to start at a specific spot, we could click on the custom value for anchor. We could say, I want my first bar to start at 0, right? So that first bar that comes up on the bar chart should capture mileages that start at 0 and they go to some value, right? And that some value is what we're going to define in this bin sizes box. So again, we could leave it in automatic and let SPSS decide essentially how wide those bars should be. And when I say wide, I'm not necessarily talking about the width that appears on the graph, but what range of values should be encompassed by each bar. So if I click on custom, I can define this in my own way according to one of two possible options. I can either tell SPSS the number of intervals I want, which is basically me saying how many total bars should my graph have, right? And so if the first bar starts at 0 and I tell SPSS how many bars I want the chart to have, it's going to decide how many miles in this example get grouped into each bar. Right? My other option is to say what is my interval width, which in this example would be saying how many miles get grouped into each bar, and then SPSS just determines how many bars the chart is going to have based on how many miles each bar represents, right? So what I have found is that sometimes you can specify the number of bars that you want, and for whatever reason SPSS still won't give you that number of bars, right? I'll give you an example of what this is. So if I say I want 7 bars in my histogram, I click continue, and really importantly I click on apply here in order to make those changes take place. And I click on OK, I actually only get a chart with 5 bars. What I think is going on is that SPSS is actually leaving space for 2 more bars, but there weren't any observations in our data set that would fit into those bars. So technically the bars are there, but they have no observations, so there aren't really bars there, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars, and then a 6th and 7th empty bar. Not really sure why SPSS chooses to do that, but I'm going to show you a way to work around that. So if I go back to my chart builder, and back to the parameters on this element properties box, instead of saying I want 7 bars, I'm going to say that I want each bar to represent a range of 3 miles. So if my first bar starts at 0 and every bar represents a range of 3 miles, that first bar is going to represent miles 0, 1, and 2. So any participant that biked no miles, 1 mile, or 2 miles in that first week of training, they're all going to be counted in that first bar. So I click continue, click apply, click OK, and now I've got a chart with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bars, and actually even potentially an 8th empty bar here, but I've got something more along the lines of what I want. So I think my overall general point here is that in order to get the chart you want, the best thing to do is go into Chart Builder, go into these parameters of the element properties, and just play around with either the number of intervals or the interval width, as well as your anchor point, until you get a histogram that represents what you're really interested in. Okay? Those are the basics for histograms, and again, histograms are for representing continuous data, but continuous data that's discrete, meaning we only measure it at specific intervals. Hopefully that was helpful. Check back for some of the tutorials on the other types of graphs that we're going to be using, and you can get some more details on bar graphs, frequency polygons, and descriptive statistics that are going to be useful when you're just getting started out with SPSS. Okay, see you back soon.